Good afternoon, everyone. I want just to welcome everybody, say happy 2015. We're really glad that you can be here with us today. We also hope that you can join us for our regular RICSRI event series. This is the first of our lunchtime seminar series, and they happen about once a month. And our next series is going to be on February 19th, and we're going to have Fox Harrell speaking. There are flyers on your table, so you can take one with more details about the talk. Ooh, and then our third series of the quarter is going to be on March 12th with Professor Petronilha Gonçalves de Silva, who's a visiting professor on campus this quarter, so we hope that you can also join us then. And now the other flyer on your table I wanted to turn your attention to is our Faculty Fellows Chautauqua series. So if you can join us then, we have Professor Catherine Jin Lum, who's going to be speaking about her book, Damnation, Hell in America, From Revolution to Reconstruction. So if you want to come to that event, make sure to RSVP because you get a free copy of the book. And we hope you can come discuss Catherine's new work with us. All right. Now, before I turn it over, let me find my notes here, to Hazel Marcus, director of our Research Institute, who's going to introduce our speaker today, I'd like to ask everyone to join me in a moment of silence. We have a student group over at the medical school, the Biomedical Association for the Interest in Minority Students. They're also called BioAIMS, who's holding actually a protest today, a peaceful demonstration over at the medical school in solidarity with the Black Lives Matters movement and in conjunction with Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, which is today. And so we feel so bad that the events conflicted, but we also want to collaborate and support them. So if you'll join me for a minute in remembrance of Martin Luther King and also in support of the Black Lives Matters movement. Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And now I'd like to turn it over to Hazel Marcus, director of our Research Institute, and she will introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Mariam. It's great to see everybody here, and I think it's because when Paula Moya speaks, people listen. And I told her that as I twisted her arm into giving this RICSRI seminar because she said, I've just completed my new book and I will do a Chautauqua next year. So why should I do, this year? And I said, because what you're doing is so important and so relevant to current events, and would you please do it? And Paula, being a very independent soul, but also a very interdependent soul, let her arm be twisted, and I'm really happy that she did. Paula Moya, for many of you, needs no introduction. She is my very good friend, colleague, co-author, and co-instructor. She is Associate Professor of English and, by courtesy, of Iberian and Latin American cultures. Just a little background, Paula did her undergraduate work at the University of Houston. She went on to do her PhD in English and American Literature at Cornell. Stanford was her first job, and she's been here ever since. She's a major contributor to the university. Currently, at this moment, she's director of modern thought and literature, and I want to take this opportunity to thank that program for co-sponsoring our seminar today. That's wonderful. She's been vice chair of English for 3 years, and very most relevant to us today, she was director of the undergraduate program, and from 2002 to 2005, and I personally am looking forward to future service of Paula Moya at CCSRE. She's received multiple awards. Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching is one that stands out for me, which brings me to. I just want to make two big points about Paula because there's so many things to say about her, but I think these 2 points both have to do with her outstanding teaching and scholarship and how they go hand in hand. The first thing I would say, which impresses me so much in my experience with Paula across many domains, is that she never shies away from the hard things. She boldly goes where few of us are comfortable treading, and that's outside our comfort zone. She goes outside her comfort zone all the time. For example, in our class on Introduction to Comparative Studies, we felt the need to confront the work on genes and biology, because today, the idea that you can scrape your cheek, send in $150, and get back, your ancestors and everything about yourself was leading students to really question, well, what's that stuff about biology and race? We thought race wasn't a biological concept, and how can you understand that? And so much of that was going on this campus. Paula said, wait, we have to really understand this. We have to know this. We have to teach this to our students so our students can teach other students. So what she did was insist on seminars from Marcus Feldman in biology, from Carlos Bustamante, so that she could learn the latest biology, so that she could begin to communicate to students the very important concept of the biogeographical ancestry. That's something we can find out about ourselves, but that's different from our social and historical understanding of race, and try to figure a way to present this to students. Another example, recently in immigration, and we're talking about how many people are arguing that actually immigrants create jobs rather than take away jobs, if you read the latest research of The Economist. But when you say this to the students, they're like, well, how do you know this? And Paula said, okay, we can't just say that. We got to go read what the economists are saying, and that's not easy. But she always does that. In her, let me just tell you about her four important publications. First, one of the first, Reclaiming Identity, Realist Theory and the Predicament of Postmodernism. A second book, Learning from Experience, Minority Identities, Multicultural Struggles. The book on Doing Race, 21 Essays for the 21st Century. And her forthcoming book, which is called The Social Imperative, Race, Close Reading, and Contemporary Literary Criticism. So throughout all of these books, she makes many important points, but two that have impressed me. So just let me tell you about those two. One is her insistence on a realist view of identity, by which she means, we are not completely determined by our identities, by those important social categories of race, ethnicity, gender, class, religion, but neither can we be completely free of them. And she insists on that and what that means. And so that means that people with different experiences in the world, located differently in the world, will have different identities. They'll bring those identities into their classrooms, into their workplaces, into their communities, and that means that they are having different experiences there. And so as a society, she insists that rather than getting beyond those identities or sort of leaving them at the door, we need to grapple with these identities, learn how to mobilize them, use them as resources at school, at work. And she insists on that in her scholarship, and she insists on that in her teaching. And then a second point that has been so impressive to me that shows up throughout her work is that when it comes to understanding how identities structure experience and appreciating the formation of worlds that are anchored in identities other than your own, there's no more efficient and effective way to do this than close reading of literature. And she has made this point so impressively, and I think that's what she will do today. I mean, in the close reading of imaginative literature that touches on all of our topics, race, gender, ethnicity, religion, you can have a window to the way that sociocultural worlds shape experience. For example, if you're going to read Toni Morrison, or if you're going to read Elena Maria Viramontes or Junot Diaz, through attention, very careful attention to their work, to its themes, to its structures, to the plot, to the symbolism, you can have access to other ways of being, other subjectivities, other worlds that would be mostly invisible and would be seldom revealed through the kinds of methodologies that people like me, social scientists, would use, surveys, interviews, behavioral analysis. You get a lot from that as well. But there's what you can get from a close reading of literature is something additional. And really, we can all have access to it if we can learn to do these close readings. So let me stop. Paula, just by summing it up, is a prototype of the CCSRE scholar, meaning she's an ideal. Her work is groundbreaking. it's comparative, it's multidisciplinary, and she never lets her eye off the importance of how the knowledge she's creating and transmitting can promote a more just society. So my great pleasure, Paula.
Thank you, Hazel. You can all see, I'm sure, why I can never say no to Hazel for just about anything. I'm very pleased to be here, really. And I'm so impressed to see you all out here. Every time I give a talk, I'm sure there's going to be like 3 people in the audience, one of whom's going to be Ramon, the other one's going to be Jose David, and the third will be Hazel. So it's very gratifying to see that people came out. I should warn you, I will open with reference to the goings-on in Ferguson, Missouri. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about them. I have tried to keep my remarks reasonably, within a reasonable time frame so that we can come back to a discussion of those. I know that is what is on the mind of a lot of you today, and they're important things that we need to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we'll just move forward. All right. So, in a November 2014 article about Darren Wilson's testimony to the grand jury, Slate.com reporter Jamal Bowie details the way Wilson described the unarmed teenager he shot and killed. Bowie recapitulates the sequence of events as narrated by Wilson and pulls out selected quotes to show that the officer perceived Brown to be a threat to his own safety. Now, what emerges from Wilson's description is an image of a brutish, menacing, aggressive, and Hulk-like, superhuman black man. Now, Bowie, and the reason I'm talking about this is because I want you to go ahead and go to that article. It's actually very good, and I don't need to recapitulate that article because I think it will be good for you to read it. But he grants that Wilson's account of what happened fits the facts of the case. He notes that it is consistent with forensic evidence. But he says the fact that it's possible doesn't make it believable, and looking at the story, I think it's ludicrous. Now, Bowie's judgment that the story is ludicrous is meant to cast doubt on the truth, if you will, of Wilson's testimony regarding the sequence of events. But he also wants to call into question the referential accuracy of Wilson's perception of Brown. He doesn't think that Wilson is lying about how he perceived Brown, but he points out that Wilson perceives Brown through the schema of the black brute, a stock figure of white supremacist rhetoric in the lynching era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This schema, which figures black men as menacing, powerful creatures with a superhuman capacity both for violence and for physical endurance, not only justified or served to justify in the minds of the lynchers the lynching of black men during the turn of the 20th century, but it also provided fuel for a rising eugenics movement. Now, the refusal to indict Darren Wilson for the killing of the unarmed teenager Michael Brown, the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin, the failure to indict Daniel Pantaleo for the chokehold death of Eric Garner, and the gunning down in the park of the 12-year-old Tamir Rice by an officer who had previously been judged unfit, not to mention the subsequent shackling of Tamir's 14-year-old sister when she tried to render him aid. These incidents have galvanized blacks, other people of color, and their white allies in a manner that has brought to light countless other cases of brutality toward men, women, and children of color. And while it is unlikely that police have become more brutal of late, or that whites as a group have become more racist than they used to be, it is clear that people of color, and especially African Americans, are not willing to accept this state of being anymore. From freeway shutdowns in Berkeley and Los Angeles to die-ins here at Stanford University, at New York City Hall and Grand Central Station, from the blocking of traffic in Palo Alto to the reading of names of slain African Americans to bothered white brunchers in New York City, protesters enraged by a disregard for the way Black lives have been valued have sought to interrupt business as usual. While at one time whites as a group, and I don't mean whites as individuals, I trust that you all understand that I'm making that distinction. While at one time whites might have been able to look away and ignore the suffering caused by racism to people of color, they are finding it much harder to do so. All of this has made painfully evident to some and has brought to the attention of others what scholars of race and ethnicity have known for some time. That is, that people associated with different races employ divergent schemas to interpret their world. And when I got to this point in putting together the panel, I almost become overwhelmed thinking about the dearth of research of just my colleagues here at Stanford that illustrate this point, that I decided not to present that until you'll see that when you listen to them. But I mean, it's just an incredible dearth of research. Now, the point that I want to make is that people don't just see race. We also read it, actively engaging in interpretive practices that draw upon widely available schemas that attribute particular meanings to different bodies, styles, and places. As Wilson's testimony about Brown indicates, racist schemas motivate bad choices. I have to shoot. And also are recruited to justify behaviors. That is, I feared for my life. Okay, so what are schemas? The concept itself, schema, is one that I am taking from social psychology, and this reflects all the work that I have been doing with Hazel and with all the rest of my social psychological colleagues that I spent time with. Now, in social psychology, and as I use the term, schema refers to the active organization of past experiences, okay, both physical and emotional, and past reactions, sensory motor as well as cognitive affective, through which a person apprehends and interacts with incoming stimuli. Now, as structures that have been built up through a person's past behavior and experiences in specific domains, schemas serve as patterns for one's current and future behavior in both that and in perceptually related domains. They are central to cognition insofar as they allow a person to go beyond the information given, to fill in the gaps, to extrapolate from what is known or what is given that might be apparent or might not have yet appeared. And schemas thus have a temporal dimension characterized by evolution across time. So schemas, in other words, are anticipatory as well as retrospective, even though they orient a person's behavior in the present moment. Now, there's a substantial body of evidence of experimental psychological research that supports the existence and functioning of schemas. The term was first applied to psychological phenomena in 1920 by the English neurologist Henry Head. Subsequently, the English psychologist Frederick Bartlett used it to refer to the cognitive processes and overt actions involved in the organization of past experiences for the purposes of understanding and recall. The concept is also central to the work of developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, who used it to help explain the way children develop their cognitive skills. So many different psychologists over the past century have elaborated the concept by demonstrating empirically that the activation of schemas derived from past experience is fundamental to people's ability to organize information coherently enough to perceive and remember. Now, okay, so I just gave you a lot of stuff about schema. So so in the service of showing how schemas work to direct attention, condition perception, and shape interpretation, I'm going to just start with a short exercise here to illustrate the importance of attending carefully to a specific aspect of a given text. Now, the text in this case is a video, and in this video that I'm going to show you just now, there are two teams of players. One team is wearing black, the other team is wearing white. I want you, as you watch it, to pay careful attention, counting the number of times that the players wearing white pass the ball.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes.
Who noticed the gorilla? Who didn't? Okay, so the very fact that some people did not notice the gorilla sort of makes the point, okay? Now, according to the research done by the psychologists that did this, about half the people who see the video for the first time will miss the gorilla. Okay. For those of you who did miss it, what happened is that I activated for you a ball passing schema. Because you were attending closely to the ball passing, you missed something else that was going on, something that in retrospect is completely obvious. Now, the activity of directing your attention to a particular feature of the environment is what social psychologists refer to as priming. So, if I had told you to watch for the gorilla, that is, if I had given you a gorilla prime, then you would have certainly seen the gorilla. But you probably would not have been able to count the number of passes that either team made. Now, maybe you have seen this particular experiment, and I know there's a number of social psychologists in here, so I expect that you have. And you saw the gorilla. But did you notice anything else? The curtain. Did you notice the curtain changed color and that one of the ball players wearing black left the game? Okay.
Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
So this video is an updating in 2010 of the original video from 1999 by the psychologist Christopher, I don't know how to say it, Chabris or Chabris? Anyway, Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simmons. The two of them have done a number of studies illustrating the basic point that people often fail to see what is right in front of them. There will always be more stimuli in your environment than you can possibly apprehend. For this reason, perception is not a matter of looking out on the world and seeing what is there. Rather, perception is about filtering the barrage of incoming stimuli so that some small part of it can be observed. Now, before I go further, I want to emphasize two really important things about schemas. First, schemas are self-relevant. Second, they are learned. Because the fundamental units of the self-system, the core conceptions, are predicated on significant interpersonal relationships, a person's set of schemas develop and evolve over the course of his or her life in conjunction with her identity as a being in a world full of other beings. Accordingly, the set of schemas any person possesses will be constituted by her bodies of knowledge, her collection of ignorances, her sociocultural biases, and her dispositional attitudes toward learning about new and different situations. Now, many, if not most, of a person's schemas will be shared with others who are similarly situated within a particular society. So, for instance, racial, gender, and class schemas are often shared within a demographic group. But of course, other schemas are particular to the person. and will be shaped by their idiosyncratic likes and dislikes. For instance, whether you like birds, right, and you see birds everywhere, or you just got pregnant, in which case you see pregnant ladies everywhere, right? So this is how schemas work. Now, this is where I, as a literary critic and as a teacher of literature, come in. As a literary critic, what interests me is how understanding schemas works. Okay, I'm not sure I said this. It's how understanding schemas helps us understand how literature works. Now, of course, it goes without saying that readers bring with them to the scene of reading their own sets of schemas, and sometimes in past talks I've focused on that. But on this time, what I want to focus on is the fact that schemas are also embedded into works of literature. As such, they direct a reader's attention, condition her perception, and shape the resulting interpretation. Insofar as literature is a system of social communication through which information, ideas, and norms are transmitted from author to reader and among different communities of readers, it really matters not only what literature we teach, but also how we teach it, and importantly, to whom. Because not all literature is going to sound the same way to every reader. Now, in the book that I am putting the finishing touches on, I focus on those works of literature that interrupt business as usual. I begin from the premise that my authors are astute, critical, cultural critics whose fictional works are extended and theoretically sophisticated meditations on and inquiries into race, ethnicity as a system of social distinction. These authors use a variety of methods to highlight the social constructedness or the doing of race and ethnicity. Authors like Toni Morrison and Junot Díaz, for example, explicitly thematize the way that people read race onto the bodies of other people. But they also facilitate, through the use of metaphors, motifs, intertextual allusions, and narrative structures, the development of alternative racial schemas that have a more referentially accurate relationship to the social world than those that generally circulate broadly in public discourse. As such, these authors are directly engaged in challenging the dominant narratives of white supremacy. So consider, for example, the title of Junot Díaz's short story, How to Date a Brown Girl, Black Girl, White Girl, or Halfie. How many of you read this short story? It's a great short story. The rest of you should definitely take a look. Now, the reader who approaches this story without reading it through the intersecting lenses of race, gender, and sexuality would be perverse indeed. In suggesting that the story will take the form of a set of guidelines for how to date a girl, the title makes a direct second-person address to the reader, who is, after all, the putative recipient of the proffered advice. Like Althusser's policeman, who subjects the passing pedestrian to the authority of the state by calling out to him, so does the title of this story hail the reader as learner, thus seeking to interpolate her into its system of racial understanding. The title further informs us that the girl will be a type, a racial type. Through the title's proliferation of female racial types who are apparently available to be dated, it nixes the notion that there might be a generic, that is, a non-racialized ideal called girl. Finally, the title invokes the commonly accepted but much less commonly acknowledged practice of treating people differently according to the race, class, gender, sexuality with which they are associated. All of this before you begin to read the story itself. Now, the story does many other things that I'm not going to talk about right now, but as this one example makes clear, first lines, epigraphs, and chapter titles of novels or titles of short stories are key tools that authors use to prime the readers who approach their texts. Such primes are meant to capture the reader's attention, condition her perception, and shape the resulting interpretation. So I'm going to turn now to the second example, Toni Morrison's A Mercy. So in A Mercy, Morrison grapples with two phenomena normally perceived as distinct, but which she represents as being fundamentally intertwined. So these two phenomena, right? Right, race as a system of social classification on one hand, and second, the ethics and activities involved in reading texts, including but not limited to the text of the racial other. At stake in Morrison's exploration of race in A Mercy is her attempt to do with race what she did with slavery in her magnum opus, Beloved. That is, she wants to break it open to examine its origins and find out what it does to its those who are its victims, as well as those who benefit from its operations. Accordingly, she looks to a time and a place in which the color-coded racial schemas that many U.S. Americans now perceive as simply natural were just coming into being. So Morrison deliberately chose the setting. I don't want that just yet. She deliberately chose the setting of A Mercy to facilitate her meditations about the origins of race and racism. In an interview about the writing of the novel, Morrison explains what motivated her choice of the time period. She says, "I was looking for a time before slavery and black became married, before racism became established, but when slavery was the most common experience of most people." She goes back to the beginning of our country to imagine what it might have been like, and also to rewrite the narrative that we now have about the beginning of this country. She says, "Dividing the world up ethnically or racially was a deliberate and sustained event that grew. But before that, I just wanted to suggest what it could have been like, what it might have been like, before the narrative that we now have about the beginnings of this country." So, I want to ask you, what might be gained by looking back to a time before race? The possibility that we might envision a future beyond it. This is why the events in the novel take place over a period of about 8 years from 1862 to 1690 in the American colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and what is most likely present-day Massachusetts. It's not named as such. The novel is thus set at a historical moment before blackness and slavery were indissolubly linked, but in a geographic and economic setting where that linkage was just coming into being. Now, the difficulty and urgency of learning to read well. This is actually something that Morrison has been obsessed with since The Bluest Eye, but I won't spend time talking about that. Just take my word for it. Anyway, the difficulty and urgency of learning to read well is communicated in the novel's opening lines. The first sentence, "Don't be afraid," is an injunction. Okay, that's the first sentence, "Don't be afraid." It's an injunction that positions the reader as the recipient of an urgent communication. This sense of having blundered onto an obscure but pointed message is reinforced a few seconds later when the second-person narrator hails us with an observation that borders on an accusation. "You know. I know you know." The insistence with which the narrator asserts our prior knowledge implicates us in our role as reader while highlighting the question of responsibility for the resulting interpretation. This twinned preoccupation with reading and responsibility surfaces again in the two questions around which A Mercy is structured. One question is, who is responsible? And the other is, can you read? Okay. So, according to the logic of the novel, learning to read well indicates and transcends the usual capacity to decipher alphabetic text. Immediately after asking if we can read, the narrator, who we later on find out is the slave girl Florence, informs us, "If a peahen refuses to brood, I read it quickly." And sure enough, that night I see, okay, so who knows Portuguese here? Can you pronounce this for me? Miyamai, thank you. I see, this means my mother in Portuguese. That night I see a Miyamai standing hand in hand with her little boy, my shoes jamming the pocket of her apron. The novel's first mention of reading thus references a sign that Florence interprets as indicating that she will dream that night about being abandoned by her mother. Later on in the novel, we learn that Florence is able to read and write alphabetic script. So it is noteworthy that the first reference to the activity of reading refers outward to an animist world shot through with meaning. The question that is posed to us in the novel, importantly, is not can you see, but can you read? Reading, rather than seeing, is the operative metaphor in the novel for the processes involved in interpretation and understanding. Now, this distinction is crucial. It belies that idea that I was talking about earlier, that we merely look out and see the world, quote, as it really is, while also pointing to the whole range of activities involved in arriving at the interpretation of any given situation. Distinguishing reading from seeing in this way clearly foregrounds interpretation as a learned practice that depends on a reader's culturally competent grasp of the socially situated conventions and codes across a wide range of human and non-human interactions. It is not incidental that the entire plot of the novel turns on a misunderstanding, that is, Florence misreading of a text that is social rather than alphabetic, namely the social text of the crucial encounter in which her mother offered her to her future master, the Dutch-English trader Jacob Vark. By figuring interpretation as reading rather than seeing, Morrison stages an implicit critique of a naturalist or essentialist conception of race. And that is because race, as it emerges over the course of the novel, is not a thing that inheres in a person's body or blood. Rather, it is a way of reading others for the purpose of deciding how to interact with them. We do not look out and naturally see race. We read it onto the body of the other. So I want to make the point that interpretation in A Mercy is not merely a thematic concern. Okay, she thematizes it, but it's also a formal one, as demonstrated by the novel's character system and its anomalous distribution of narrative perspective and character space. So the protagonist of A Mercy is a young slave woman named Florence. Now, she was born in 1682 in Maryland as a result of a gang rape that had been orchestrated to break, as well as to mate, her enslaved West African mother. Besides Florence, there are 7 major characters. They include Jacob Vark, who is an Anglo-Dutch trader who owns the farm, all the goods, and most of the people on it. Lena, a Native American slave. Sorry, I didn't want to go there yet. Owned by Jacob Vark. Rebecca Vark, who is the lower-class English-born wife of Jacob Vark. Sorrow, a mixed-race servant to Jacob Vark. Willard and Scully, 2 indentured white servants who are unleased to Jacob Vark. And Amia May, Florence's enslaved West African mother. So these people, the point I'm making is that these are major characters rather than minor characters because they each take a turn focalizing the narrative for the space of one chapter. What this means is that the images, the metaphors, and the narratives of that chapter that they each focalize conform to their cognitive affective schemas such that the reader ends up perceiving the world through their eyes. Now, the narrator and focalizer of the first chapter is the protagonist, Florence. and she's speaking in the second person. And later on in the novel, we find out that she's actually writing to Blacksmith. So she's writing the text that we were reading, and the intended recipient is Blacksmith. Now, the second chapter features an extra diegetic narrator speaking in the third person, but the primary focalizer of that, the one who's kind of orienting the narrative, is Jacob. That means that the perceptions, attitudes, and judgments, as well as the metaphors and stories contained within the Vark chapter, are attributable primarily to him. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Okay, within the novel as a whole, people of the Roman Catholic faith are not invariably represented as papists. Okay, but in Jacob Vark's chapter, they are, because that is how he perceives them. So together, the first two chapters set the general pattern followed throughout the rest of the narrative. Every odd chapter, so the white lines here, features, the green lines, features Florin's second-person narrative voice writing to Blacksmith. These are interspersed with the even chapters, each of which is focalized by a different major character, but narrated by an extra diegetic narrator speaking in the third person. As with the Vark chapter, the focalizer of each of the even chapters supplies the majority of the attitudes, perceptions, judgments, and metaphors in that chapter. There is only one character besides Florence who both narrates, right, speaks in the voice of, and orients, focalizes the chapter, and that's Mia May, and that's at the last chapter here. Okay, so the point of all of this is that if you look at the narrative structure here, there is a mismatch between the power that Jacob Vark has as a member of colonial society and the power that Florence has as the primary teller of this tale. At the level of the story, Jacob brings together the different characters that populate the novel. He is the only character with the social and political and economic power to pull the motley assortment people toward him and to compel them to do his will. Now, importantly, he possesses his power not because he is the smartest or the strongest character, although he is both smart and strong, but rather because he is the only character who is backed up by the strength of the emerging social, religious, legal, and economic institutions represented in the novel. Florence, by contrast, is weak and unimportant at the level of the story. But because Morrison accords her, notice, nearly half the narrative space, and because she is only one of two characters to speak in the first person, Florence is the most powerful character at the level of novelistic discourse. And I hope this is not terribly boring for any of you non-literary critics, but I trust that literary critics will get the importance of this. Okay, now my point in all of this, and boring those of you who are not literary critics, is that my point in highlighting the disjuncture between the relative power Jacob and Florence each have on the story level versus the discourse level is to suggest that were it not for Morrison's aesthetic choices, Florence's would remain the untold tale. By giving so much of the character space to Florence, Morrison is troubling by calling attention to the power structure that would have existed in colonial America. So what this means is that rather than reflecting actual structures of inequitable distribution, as was the case in the 19th century bourgeois novel as analyzed by my colleague Alex Wallach, Morrison's narrative structure enacts a redistribution of narrative space. Okay, so a kind of redistribution of power, one that attempts to redress the imbalance of power accorded to them by the fictional society in which they live. Moreover, by illuminating the multiple and intersecting worldly contexts that provide the content for all human consciousness, Morrison reminds us that consciousness presupposes a sociality, a set of values, characteristic ways of interacting, and particular persons who actively inhabit specific geographic and physical spaces. So, what is the impact of all of this? So differently than Diaz in How to Date, but with similar goals, Morrison elucidates, extends, and deepens the Du Boisian notion of double consciousness. Okay, now I don't mean to suggest that the Du Boisian notion of double consciousness is not an important one that doesn't continue to have relevance. But it is also important that we recognize those intellectuals, those cultural critics is existing today, like Morrison and like Diaz. So I'm elevating them to this, right? To understand the way that they are deepening, that they are elaborating, extending this notion. As both of them move readers away from us-them binaries that are often figured in terms of black-white, female-male, worker-capitalist. I mean, you can just go on and on and on. They move us away from those dichotomies toward a recognition of ontological multiplicity. So literature, and I'm coming to my conclusion here, and then I would like to have a discussion about these issues in relation to the present-day challenges with which we are faced. Literature builds for us schemas through which we interpret the world. Now, all literature does this. I have chosen to analyze that literature that I see doing something different than just, continuing the typical narrative of how we understand the world. Literature alters our perceptions. It teaches us how to interpret unfamiliar phenomena. Literature makes us think, but it also makes us feel by taking us into the worlds of these characters. To the extent that we can follow a storyline, we have to get involved with them. Literature gives us language, but it also prompts us to form images in the mind that evoke for us a whole variety of associations. It engages us then at a cognitive, affective level. It is therefore both an important tool and a powerful actor in the struggle to create what we might call racial literacy. Okay, thank you.